You're listening to the Music Book Podcast with your host, Marc Masters.
Give me a little bit of the background in terms of how this book idea started. Was this an idea that you'd had for a while? Was it something you talked about with other people? Did you sketch out some ideas before you thought it would be a book? How did all that start?
It was quite haphazard, I would say. It really started for me a lot during COVID when I think there was just nothing really going on. And really just to maintain my sanity, I would wake up and try to put in, a couple of hours on my computer just writing. And I had just finished a book then, so I was not really eager to get started on something new. And I think it must have been like some kind of Freudian wish fulfillment, because you want to go out, you want to see people, and you want to hear music. And so I
Mhm.
just found myself really randomly jotting down memories of seeing the Boredoms or seeing Jeff Mangum or, working at a venue for a couple years. And I did this for about 6 months without looking up dates, without really putting anything in order. And the reason I
Mhm.
mention that is because at a certain point, I realized I had, a number of pages and maybe it made sense to see like if there was some kind of through line. And it was only then, really a couple months in that I realized that all of these events were kind of falling within this window of 2004 to 2014. And,
Mhm.
on the one hand, the reason for that is obvious. I think that those happen to be the first 10 years that I lived here. And that was when I was in my late 20s and 30s and just going out 6 nights a week and really having a lot of fun. But I realized, when I started looking up just news events and things that had happened in politics and local stuff and nationally and internationally, that almost all these events were falling within, basically the Bloomberg era, which for all, to the extent that they're thought of at all, I think today, it's certainly not as, this cultural utopia. If anything, it's thought of as,
Mhm.
a very kind of yuppie Sex and the City, Marc Jacobs era, which it was. And so it was really only at that point that I thought, maybe the story here is less about myself and more about what was going on at the time. And I was reading a lot during COVID, and a book that I found, and it's not a music book at all, but it really inspired me and was very influential, was by George Packer, called The Unwinding. And
Mhm.
that's his book essentially about the Great Recession and what happened in America kind of leading up to the real estate market falling apart. And so reading just kind of about contemporary America, it made me realize how much of that story is kind of baked into this thing of
Hmm.
this music scene. And yeah, I just thought that there hadn't really been a book on the music section, certainly about this, but even, if you want to read about the country from George W. Bush into Barack Obama, there's fewer books about it than you would think.
That's interesting. So it's interesting that you bring that up because this book had more sort of the social, cultural, political context than I would have guessed if I had to just guess how much. I mean, there's a lot of that in it in a good way. I think it really sets a lot of good context, and you even have those in between some sections. You just have pages of just quotes of all the kind of things that were going on, just sort of the atmosphere of this meme and this. I don't know if there were memes back then, but this happening and it's really, I think it really makes it a much richer book that way. It's very astute about the politics and the things that were and how those things affected. But I'm curious that it doesn't sound like that was necessarily what you set out to do initially. You were just kind of writing your memories of the scene. At what point did you say, I really need to delve deep into what was happening economically, politically, and also how much like research did you have to do? I'm sure a lot of that you remembered having lived it, but you probably had to go back to magazines and newspapers and things like that to figure all that out.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for picking up on that. That really,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a way, you tell people you wrote a book about the indie music scene in Brooklyn in the early aughts, they're like, okay. But then, there's an aspect in which it's maybe broader than that, and it's really
Mm-hmm.
about America in those years.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that happens to be kind of the way I think about music and the sort of books I like to read. This is the third book that I will have done, and the one
Mm-hmm.
before, is kind of a playful history of Pearl Jam in the 90s, but it's really just as much about also kind of the social history and cultural mood of the times, because I feel like there's an interesting way in which music both reflects and, is impacted by the time that it's in. And you'd be surprised, I guess, kind of how quickly these memories fade. I feel like maybe when you were on the East Coast and a lot of this
Mm-hmm.
time that I was writing about, these things like, when Jay-Z and Beyonce came to see Grizzly Bear, for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of this instant signifier for this moment, which whether you were there or not, you kind of
Right.
instantly understood. And now a lot of
Right.
people are like, huh, that actually happened. Like,
Right.
so.
Right. Yeah, stuff gets memory hold fast for sure, faster than you ever imagine at the time when it seems like it's all everybody knows, and then suddenly no one remembers it.
I mean, I myself, I tried to go back and read. You can find pretty good books about, let's say, the George W. Bush era. You can find pretty good books about the
Hmm.
Obama era. There's kind of less, I think, that synthesizes the two. But, I myself had
Hmm.
forgotten some of these things, like when, I mean, I knew for a while that I wanted to start the book with August 2004, which was when the Republican National Convention was held here in New York at Madison Square Garden. That was literally my first month of living here. And at the time,
Oh
I
wow.
was I was working at a nonprofit basically on 7th Avenue and 27th Street. So you'd
Hmm.
get out at either one of these subway stops and you had to have a piece of paper like to walk past a certain intersection. So to me,
Wow.
this era was really always stamped by that moment and especially the
Hmm.
election that year. I feel like
Hmm.
partly because of just how insane the pace of news has been the last decade or so. I think a lot of people forgot, just how shocking in a way that election was, and how in a way it
Hmm.
almost felt like a dress rehearsal for 2016, because you saw, tens of millions of people seeing an invasion of a country on totally fake pretenses, and they said, "Yeah, sign me up for more of that."
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And after that, I think it became a lot harder to be surprised by a lot of these things. And I do think that a
Mhm.
lot of the music and it's things that you wouldn't really put together, but things as different as, Lightning Bolt and Deerhoof, like they were paying attention to the news, and that music is all, I think, a reflection of what was happening then.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned the sort of beginning the book with the RNC, and you do lay out at one point that there's sort of a three-part, or at least a three-point kind of guide to the narrative, which is the RNC in 2004 and that election. Then the middle of this decade, so your decade is 2004 to 2014. The middle of it is sort of the high point when like Dirty Projectors and Grizzly Bear and Animal Collective are all kind of getting a lot more than what they might have expected in terms of attention, because none of them were making like straight up pop music. And then the end of it is sort of when some of the clubs like 285 Kent and Glasslands and Death by Audio got wiped out by Vice buying that whole building and everything. So that's an interesting arc, I think. I'm wondering when that arc kind of occurred to you. Yeah, I mean, I could also ask you about the internal structure of each thing, but maybe you could give me the sort of the big arc. Did that kind of come out of the writing as you were doing it, make you realize that those are kind of main pressure points along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was always obvious that 2014 just being the year that those three DIY establishments in Williamsburg closed down within a year, that
Mm-hmm.
felt like, kind of the coup de grace, like at the moment. But then, you look at the headlines, what was going on that year, and not only was that the year that Bloomberg stepped down and Bill de Blasio was sworn in, but it was the year of Eric Garner in Staten Island and Mike Brown and Ferguson, and I think you could make the case that like by that year, that was when a lot of people started wondering like where did this post-racial society that we were supposed to have brought in. I mean, I think a lot of people never bought into that in the first place, but by that year, it seemed especially threadbare.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing I think is interesting about your structure. So you have some chapters dedicated straight up to bands, groups or individuals. Well, bands, and then also individuals who are working on things. Then like there's chapters on specific venues, which also delve into the individuals are behind them. I'm curious. First of all, how you came upon the idea. I really like. I think I typed in some of the things you in your book, and one of them was I chose to write about the lives of lesser known musicians, as I think their experience was more representative of the scene and more useful in terms of understanding the era. I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think a lot of it would have been easy to make a book that's the groups that I mentioned that was just Animal Collective, Grizzly Bear, and it probably would have been the kind of thing that a publisher might have even pressured you to do. It's like you're not going to talk about all the big bands, although that's been somewhat done too. But I think beyond it just being whether they're big or not, is you pick bands that kind of floated in the in betweens and sort of represented the different challenges and different things could go up and things could go down, and they weren't none of them have this kind of linear trajectory where they get bigger, they get play bigger venues, they sell more records. They all kind of fluctuate a little bit, which I think, I mean, I've always thought of for years thought of Oneida as the most typical representative of a band that just doesn't, they're too noisy for pop, they're too pop for noise, they're they always fit inside cracks, and they had their own like universe. Like what they did made total sense from record to record, but yet it never like fulfilled somebody's expectations of, oh, this is going to sell more, that. So they were a great example. But I'm curious how you determined that you thought those were the best kind of stories to tell, and then once you did, how you went about picking who you thought you would write about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, it was a long process, honestly. I started with a pretty different list of people that I ended up with, and it definitely got refined, I would say, over, a year and a half, 2 years. I would say this, one of the cool things about not only Brooklyn, but a lot of the regional scenes that were happening during this time, whether it's Baltimore
Mhm.
or San Francisco or Toronto or Montreal, there may have been fewer like world conquering artists. There weren't that many like Jack Whites, let's just say, and Julian Casablancas, but there
Right.
were many, many other bands and records that came out. So much so that I
Mhm.
think if you asked, let's say 10 people to name five significant bands from, let's say, 2005 to 2015, you'd get a bunch of people saying Grizzly Bear and Animal Collective and Beach House and The
Mhm.
National, but you'd probably get about 30 to 35 other names, and there's, if I wrote this book again right now, half of it might be different.
Right.
It could have easily been 10 different bands. I knew I always wanted to write about Oneida. I knew I always wanted to write about Parts and Labor. But,
Hmm.
I think that I had a bit of an agenda, which was that I didn't want to write a book about 10 white indie bands. And, there are people who would say that that's what the scene was. There's some validity to that point, but it's not an accident that it starts with Oneida and it ends with Vagabon. And and I tried to make it a point kind of not to talk about the usual suspects. And that goes for both bands, but also kind of the industry folks. Like if you
Hmm.
know a bit about this era, that there's certain names and certain venues that sort of always happen to pop up. I wanted to kind of give a little bit of space to people like Noemi LaFrance, who is the woman, the choreographer, who really was the reason that McCarran Park was reopened and the pool parties happened there for 2 or 3 years. And you could make the case that that, as much as anything, was kind of the fuse that lit this whole scene.
Hmm.
These people have weirdly been written out of this story. Like, I would say it's probably more incompetence than it is malice. You know what I mean? But
Hmm.
like, even
Hmm.
the New York Times really doesn't bother to get their names right. And so it was just important to me to kind of set the record straight a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And even at the time, there can be a writing out because, like, having written for Pitchfork myself and written for other places at the time, often it's like, hey, everybody's talking about this band, so we need to talk about this band. So that perpetuates, well, we talked about it, so everybody's, it just becomes this thing where the critical consensus can be good sometimes, but it can also just be like, well, we make this band important, therefore we have to keep talking about them and not this other band because not enough people are talking. It's an old tale that's happened everywhere, but it was just cool to see some bands treated the same way that you would treat the yeah yeah yeahs or the Strokes or whatever in a book. Like, these are not necessarily, these are saying straight out they're important, but the fact that you're telling a story means that there is something important or worthy of those stories. And what I really thought was cool too about those chapters where you're focusing on specific bands and artists is it's not just kind of like, oh, here's their discography. It's a very deep dive into their who they were as people, where they came from, their backgrounds. I mean, I feel like I learned so much about how each person got into music, which is so often a story you never, even when they're getting interviewed in papers and stuff, you don't necessarily hear those stories. I'm curious how big a priority that was for you to kind of really flesh these people out.
Oh, thank you so much. It really means a lot. I really tried to, I don't know, just spend time with these folks and
Hmm.
ask them about their music, but really what brought them to New York. And I think that
Hmm.
that's really what the book is about. It happens to be about people making indie, quote, indie rock during this window, but
Hmm.
it's just really about people who move to other places in pursuit of their dreams. And that still is happening. That's always going to happen. But it did seem like, economically and just real estate wise, that it was a little bit more forgiving of a time, and you could kind of make it work on something less than a full-time job. And yeah, so to answer your question, a couple of the people that I ended up writing about, I knew about them a bit at the beginning, but they really kind of pushed themselves to the front a little bit when when you talk to them. And some people, I
Hmm.
think, I didn't want to write an oral history. I wanted to make it a narrative nonfiction, but I also wanted to let people speak for themselves a little bit. And I'm sure you can tell some of those folks, I didn't do much at all. I just kind of sat there and hit record and
Right.
let them talk
Uh-huh.
and just tried to get it right.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, but the cool thing is, I think that was a good choice not to go oral history because you still give them tons of space to talk, but then you also lay out their stories in ways that are sort of often a oral history can just be like, we're getting sound bites rather than we're finding out, oh, they went on this one tour and they barely made it through it and they almost broke up on the way back, but then they decided, well, maybe we have another record in us, and all those kind of narrative arcs are just, they're compelling. First of all, they're just fun to read, but they also sort of like naturally bring in the story of what was it like to be a band in New York at this time. What was it like to tour in those days when, already the indie touring circuit was already established, so they weren't having to carve it out, but that didn't mean you could make money touring. I mean, it's still hard.
Oh, I mean, I could talk your ear off for a while about this. I think with musicians in particular, you talk to a 3 or 4 piece band, and
Mhm.
by the time you talk to the third person, they'll mention something that kind of blows your mind, and you go back to the first person, you'll say, "Was this right?" And they'll be like,
Uh-huh.
"Oh yeah, totally. I forgot about that." Like, so
Yeah.
you're constantly like, "Oh my goodness,
Mhm.
I need the full story here."
Yeah, totally. So we've talked about structure a lot, but another structural question that I think is interesting is you could have been sort of a little modular with the chapters. There is a chronology somewhat, and certain bands fit into the beginning of the decade or middle or late part of the decade. But at the same time, you probably could have moved certain chapters to certain places, and they still would have worked in that way. But I like the rhythm. I think it's not band. It's usually like there's a this, then back to this, then over to this kind of thing, and there's not a ton of repetition, even though there are some themes that keep getting hit on. And I'm curious, it was how did that structure come together? Did you write these in the you didn't I imagine don't imagine you wrote them in the order they appear in the book, so I'm curious how that all happened.
Yeah, this is probably, if you've seen his book, it's kind of obvious the parts I'm borrowing from a little bit, but this was, also
Mm-hmm.
I think from George Packer was something I learned how in the unwinding he kind of keeps coming back to, 3 or 4 characters.
Mm-hmm.
One is like this lobbyist guy in Washington, D.C. One is like a woman in Ohio, like works in a factory. One is like a farmer. And
Mm-hmm.
at first, they don't seem to have much to do with each other, but he returns to them over this period of time, and you can tell that they each kind of embody, different parts of what's going on in America at the time. So, to
Mm-hmm.
me, each of those chapters kind of does double duty in a little way, in that they
Mm-hmm.
allow me to talk about something that seemed to me important in the era. I wrote about a band
Mm-hmm.
called Sea Ray who
Mm-hmm.
made 2 records, and they were kind of beloved to the people who knew about them, but not much beyond that. And
Mm-hmm.
they were a pretty big band, 5, 6 piece band, and you talk to them, and something that emerges pretty early on is that they came up really when that era of like the Strokes and the Walkmen were handing off to the Grizzly Bears and Dirty Projectors, but the
Mm-hmm.
dress code was still of kind of dapper men in suits and skinny black ties. And so there was
Mm-hmm.
an expectation of what a front man would look like. And it was, a
Right.
good looking guy in a leather jacket or something. The lead singer of Sea Ray, he was a good looking guy. He was, a really good singer, but he just was not really into the showmanship aspect. And so his bandmates would always say to him, like, we're on a bill with Interpol. Like we need to, we need to, do the dance a little bit. And
Uh,
he just wouldn't play ball. So you read this, and there's an aspect in which it's almost like Trotskyists and Stalinists discussing ideological rigor. You know what I mean? It's like this kind of
mhm.
vanished ethical system that doesn't exist anymore. And then,
Right.
at the end of the book, I talk about this band called Buscabulla, who's a married duo from Puerto Rico. And
Mhm.
they came really when, I think nobody was buying records, when the record labels themselves were being supplanted by Starbucks
Mhm.
and Red Bull and such. And they basically said, we want to make it in music. And, if this is what it's going to take, then we're not, too cool for that. And they are now making records with Bad Bunny. You know what I mean? So
Right.
like, so who made the right decision? It's different kinds
Mhm.
of music, but these are just 2 bands who kind of let me talk about a thread that didn't want to be too heavy-handed about.
Yeah, sure. No, I think one of the cool things about, and I'm sorry, we'll talk about other things too, but I keep harping back to the band chapters just because they're some of the most fun parts to read. Is that they without being too heavy-handed or like signaling it too much, you manage to make them be both interesting stories in and of themselves, but also little microcosms of things that happen. I mean, for me personally, just because of my connection to it, the Amen Dunes chapter about Damon was really cool because I reviewed his first 3 records for Pitchfork. So like, and I remember when the first one came out, I don't know anybody else who even knew anything about it, but I knew the label. and I really liked it. And so I felt like lucky that I even got Pitchfork to let me write about it.
Mm.
And then he kept growing and getting better and more interesting, and more people started caring about him. And then he got on bigger labels, and but he hasn't become a pop star or anything. But it's one of those. It makes me feel good about how there was that good thing to Pitchfork and other websites and the media at the time, where you could get attention for someone who had made a record out in the woods or whatever. But I mean, Bon Iver's a bigger example, but I like that. That was a little microcosm of that, how it could work organically in a good way. And also, I love the fact that you weaved in your personal story about the Love album being, because I love that. That's a great record, probably my favorite one of his, and so that also brought in that aspect of the fact that you didn't try to extract yourself from the story completely in this book. You're part of it too, because you were there, and that's a strength. That means you have some perspective, and I thought those things all came together really well in that chapter.
No, thank you. I mean, he's a funny example because when I wrote down just records that meant a lot to me, that was,
Mm-hmm.
a pretty early one that I wrote. And I honestly, I had been in touch with him. We had coffee when the record came out. We were talking about
Mm-hmm.
like a wordless music show with,
Mm-hmm.
maybe some of the people who had recorded with him, and it never quite worked
Mm-hmm.
out. But by the time I wrote him, like, I don't know, 10 years later, I didn't hear from him for 6 months. I didn't hear from him for 8 months. And, some people like just weren't that into this topic. Some people were like, I'll
Mm-hmm.
respectfully decline. So I kind of assumed that that was his case because I didn't know what else to think. And then, and then like a month before deadline, I get an email out of the blue saying, "Hey, you've been writing my old email address. Do you want to talk?"
Oh wow.
And so I had to go to my editor and be like, "I need 5,000 more words." And she's like, "You
Uh-huh.
better." She's like, "This better be worth it." And I was like, "Don't worry, I'm British." I was like, "There aren't many people I would do this for." So
Uh-huh.
he was actually the last chapter, I think, that got written.
Oh, interesting.
And we
Mm-hmm.
did quite a few interviews in like a little bit of time. And
Cool.
yeah, I mean, I think he's kind of he's kind of like a nice version of that story, isn't it? Because he's someone who really just it was 10 or 15 years before anybody threw him a bone, and he was just very stubborn and
Mm-hmm.
kept at it as he's still at it. And yeah, I think that the book is kind of 10 or 15 versions of that story.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And speaking of your relationship to his record and the fact that you bring yourself into that, you bring yourself into the book on and off in various ways, because I mean you're upfront at the very beginning. I lived this. This was part of it. I'm trying to sort of explain how exciting things were at the time, how much was happening, all the different changes, and I think that's really a strong way to go. I think it would have been, you probably didn't even consider this, but it would have been weird for this to have been more of an objective book when you had that to draw on. But I do think you balance it well, and you get out of the way when bands need to say their piece, or when you need to explain the politics or the business side of things. But then you have the one chapter, I guess it's the art versus commerce chapter, or it's called Art and Commerce, yeah, which is sort of like your mini memoir of the jobs you had there, which I thought was awesome. That was super interesting, and it brought up so many different things of how crazy the music industry can be, in the concert industry, all the different kind of, and how many they're good people trying and having trouble doing it. They're bad people who you wish wouldn't be. It's just a really cool section. So I wonder how much you were thinking as you went along, what parts of this book should be memoir-ish? What parts should I be putting myself in? Should I, am I doing it too much? Am I not doing it enough? That kind of.
Man, well, thank you just for
Hmm.
saying all that. It's,
Hmm.
I'm a person who, I feel like I may be swimming up tide a bit in this opinion, but I guess I'm a bit bummed at how much writing today is first person, is,
Hmm.
me, I. It feels
Hmm.
like whether it's a book review, a movie review, a restaurant review, you can't tell whether they're writing about themselves, their childhood, their who they know. It's, to each their own. But to me, like,
Hmm.
I always wince a bit when I myself have to use the first person or I. So, and I just feel like it's a bit more artistic to write about other people and not put
Hmm.
yourself in the middle of everything. So yeah, I think my editor maybe wanted a bit more first person stuff, and
Hmm.
and for some reason, first person stuff seems to connect with people in a way that maybe the other stuff doesn't. One thing was just very important to me, which was that this was not a book about me. You know what I mean? Because this scene, by definition, really was pretty about a lot of people. And to say that any one person, was like the Bill Graham of this moment or whatever, I think would be just a bit obscene. So, so yeah, I tried to keep it to a minimum, and it's I'm a concert producer, and so that kind of colors how I think about a lot of this stuff. And I know how, I worked at a place for 7 years that it was not small. It was 300 capacity seated or 700 people standing, which, there's much bigger places, of course, but I always, I always felt beholden not only to the artists that I put on stage, but to my colleagues. And, that means the dudes in the kitchen, that means the waitresses, that means, the guys in the office. And if I only booked a pianist playing Morton Feldman, that would be great for me. I would love that, but I would not, I would be impoverishing my staff.
Sure.
And so I'm, just aware of what the economics of a place like that are. And by extension, I also know, when someone like Brooke Baxter opens Glasslands kind of without knowing what she's doing, but turns it into this amazing community hub, and someone like Eden as well, I'm aware of how special that is, and how long they did it really with no profit motive, which is shocking. It's and what they built as a result.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't. But the funny thing too is the chapter that I mentioned that's sort of the most about you is still very much microcosmy about a lot of things that were happening then. I thought it wasn't just about you too. I mean, there's that point where you're working one place and another place is about to open and they want you to come work for them, and you're like, okay, yeah, I think I can do it, but you hold on to it. Then you get another job, I guess the Nonesuch job opportunity comes up and you get that, but you're like, well, I can't give that up, but I also can't, I think that's so many people I knew at the time and still now even, it's like, who knows what's going to work and what's not going to work, and you kind of have to just do everything you can to take every opportunity and hope that one of them sticks. And that's that's very much a young person's thing too. I don't know if I could do that now, but I remember a lot of my friends being like, well, I could be the staff writer here, but this other place wants me to write this long thing for, and so I thought that was very interesting aspect of that chapter as well.
Thank you. No, and it wasn't just me, I think we were talking over email about paper thin walls, and there's all these people like, Chris Weingarten from this period who were writers and musicians. And again, you could, like, no one was getting rich, I don't think, but you could kind of cobble, together a life from these various things. And that moment where you're talking about was around 2010, 2011. It really was a question I asked myself. I'm like, is the future in live music or is it in recorded music? Because at that time, no one would have put their money down on the labels. You know what I mean? Like that was a moment for live music, and that is changing again now. But I really had to say to myself, like, I could stay here at Nonesuch for 10 more years and wait around for this chair to open up, which may or may not happen, or I can kind of go off and do this new thing by myself, which may or may not be around in a year. That it seemed like the right decision, but it was, you just kind of scratch your head and be like, what did I do to deserve this good fortune?
Right. Totally. Well, you obviously worked pretty hard too, and you developed a lot of skills, so there was some value in what you had. But still, yeah, you always. I had times like that too, where I had opportunities. I'm like, wow, it is a good problem to have to try to figure out which opportunity to take. The one of the interesting aspects of writing a book like this, where you were involved somewhat, and some of it's, you're part of it a little bit at however much you want to be part of it, is that you're writing about people who you've met personally in various capacities, some who you've booked, some who you've just went to their shows a lot, some who you actually probably were friends with at different points. And I'm curious how what that's like in terms of, like, obviously this isn't a sort of a gossipy tell-all book. It's not a here's why the indie rock failed and these people are responsible kind of book. I mean, it's about celebrating people who were trying to do creative things. So in a way, there's not a ton of worry about about like, am I going to make them look bad? But still, you want to do right by them, and also not like glorify everybody and act like everybody was perfect. People made mistakes and things like that. So I wonder how much you thought about that as you were writing.
Yeah, I went back multiple times to everyone I interviewed and tried to just do my fact checking, and there were some things that people asked to be taken out that they had said. Most of the time I honored it. Some of the time I kind of went my own way. But
Hmm.
I had a pretty simple rule, I think, for this book, which was just I didn't want there to be any dunking. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
I didn't really, I mean, you could make the case that Vice Media, I maybe I dunk on them a bit, but I didn't want to write like the lives of saints. You know what I mean? These people aren't saints, but
Hmm.
I do feel like on the whole, there was a spirit of, again, not only in Brooklyn, in Providence and
Hmm.
Baltimore and LA and all these cities at the time. That's not to say anything is over. This is just transmuted into a different thing. But
Sure.
I do think that there was this interesting confluence of forces, some of which we were in control of, and some of which we were not. I think that
Hmm.
looking back, we just, we take for granted. I wanted to have a chapter really about like a music journalist. I wrote a version or two of this. I wrote one about an older person who worked for the Times, and I wrote about a younger
Hmm.
person who worked for Pitchfork. And in the end,
Hmm.
I just didn't really have room for it. But it
Hmm.
seemed to me that that was part of the story too, where someone like you, someone like Chris Weingarten, if
Hmm.
you were doing what you were doing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there probably would be like a Chuck Eddy type anthology of your columns, from Duke University
Right.
Press. Whereas
Right.
now you probably have 10 or 20 amazing writers whose bylines are essentially lost. You know what I mean? Like you
Right.
can
Yep.
probably go and find them on the Wayback Machine if you're super motivated, but
Right.
that's just a bummer. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
um, and we took for granted that even someone like Steve Smith would just put
Hmm.
week after week every show at the Stone in Time Out New York,
Hmm.
and it was this
Hmm.
public service that at a certain point every newspaper and magazine in New York decided that arts
Hmm.
listings weren't really worth it anymore, which is,
Right.
crazy.
Right. Yeah, it's totally crazy, totally nuts. um, so one thing that I thought you handled well at the beginning of the book, which is always going to be a challenge in a book when you're talking about a scene or a movement or just even a collection of people, is in the subtitle is "The Age of Indie Music and a Decade in New York." 2004, 2014. And so indie music is the name of what you're talking about. And so you do take some stabs at sort of defining, but it's always been such a weird moving target. Like when I was in college, indie just sort of strictly meant they're not on a major. Then it became this thing. Well, there's a certain sound to indie, and then there became a thing that it means a hybrid of those things, and it kind of changes all the time. And I think you didn't shy away from it. You didn't say, well, indie is whatever you see in it. you know, you did try to make some definitions, but you also, I don't think you like froze it into something that was too restrictive. And I'm just curious how you went about trying to figure that part out.
Yeah, to me, that word is almost unnecessarily provocative to some people. Like some people, it just
Hmm.
kind of raises their blood pressure. Some people, I, as someone who listens to a lot of classical music, you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about if what Johann Johansson and Max Richter and Mika Levy do, is it post-classical music? Is it contemporary music? Is it new music? And indie
Right.
music, the same. I don't think it's that interesting a question, just like what kind of falls under this banner. I at one
Hmm.
point in this writing process, I went to Morocco for a week just to take a trip, and I met these two kind of English blokes, and we were just having a conversation, and they said, I said, "What kind of music do you like?" And they're like, "We like indie music." And I was like, "What do you mean by indie music?" And they're like, Oasis, Arctic Monkeys, stuff like that. And I
Uh-huh.
was like, "Oh, so you mean guitar music, basically, like bands?" And they're like, "Yeah, indie music." So at that point, I was like, to each their own. This term,
Mhm.
there's something more interesting, I think, than like what falls under this banner. But it's interesting,
Yeah.
if you had told me during the writing of it that a quote indie band from Brooklyn would be on Saturday Night Live. Like I'm not sure I could have visualized it, but
Right.
there you go.
Yeah, totally, totally. Um, as you were bringing the book to the finish line, and you had like first a draft and then maybe another. What was the revising process like? How much did you do? Did you like? Are you a kind of person that likes to comb through it 1,000 times before you turn it in, or somewhere in between that and not looking at it a ton, or just curious.
No, I drove my editor and typesetter crazy. I'm just one of those very anal retentive people, and so I was revising up until the end. I was even trying to revise the sequence of the chapters, and my editor was like,
Oh wow.
"Dude,
Uh-huh.
go on." So he's like, "Go back on vacation, like you're done." Um, I sort of feel like a lot of music criticism, music history, it punches a little bit below its weight. You know what I mean? I think
Mm,
like especially compared to certainly literature, film, visual
mm,
arts, even the names that, we all respect and we have all their books. I sometimes feel like the best writers on music kind of have like 10 ears, you know what I mean? Like a little
mm.
bit. So I just try to make it the best that I can. And it was interesting when you tell people you're writing a book, again, maybe this is a sign of where the standards are at, but 99% of people will be like, it's an oral history, right? And you're like, no, like you can write a book that's not an
Right.
oral history. Like,
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I love oral histories, but I feel like there was a time maybe 10, 20 years ago where everything was an oral history, and every web article was an oral history. And I mean, I think Michelangelo Matos even did an oral history of oral histories at one point,
really.
where he talked to authors about, which was sort of a joke, I think, as much as a real article. But yeah, but I mean, I think the great thing about this, and a lot of books I've been reading lately about music, is people are starting to realize more and more that you can do kind of both, that you can give people the space to talk without it having to be bang bang all them. And oral histories in a way I feel like kind of are a little bit deceptive in thinking that the author kind of is letting everybody. I mean, they're doing as much moving around and editing as a narrative writer. They're just not inserting as
Sure.
many of their own sentences in. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was something I learned in a hurry with this book, which was,
Mhm.
some people who were interviewed for Meet Me in the Bathroom who were not happy with how it turned out. Some people who
Mhm.
were not asked and were angry as a result. That it was, I'll say this. I thought that maybe my vision was a bit rosy, but I thought, it would be a pretty simple, congratulatory, celebratory book. But there's a lot of people who had pretty raw feelings about that era. Again,
Sure.
partly because of, the way the history was written, but I don't know. It's so I tried just to make it so that there was a couple of dissenting voices and that it
Mhm.
wasn't just utopian.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of that too. So, and I think overall it's just a great book. I really, really enjoyed it. It was fun to read, but also I learned some stuff. I especially love a book where I come in thinking, well, I'm going to know everything in this, and I don't, because some books I read are like, well, I'd have no clue what this is about. And this is the exact opposite, and yet I learned a lot. I mean, I was even like during the parts and labor chapter, I actually texted Chris Weingarten and said, "I'm learning stuff about you I didn't know," which is
Yeah. Well,
so
and it's funny. I mean, it's in a way, it's funny when you're like when you're writing about a fellow writer and you know that they're going to be scrutinizing it. You're like, I got to come
yeah,
correct with this. Like,
yeah, totally.
like he would probably say this should be 1/5 as long as it is. But I'm just doing my best.
Yeah, yeah. No, my impression is he likes how it came out. So, but anyway, yeah. Thanks so much for talking to me about it, and thanks for putting such a great book together. And I wish you all sorts of luck with it, and as things move forward.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
The Music Book Podcast is produced, edited, and hosted by Marc Masters. Our theme music is by the great band Savak. Our logo was designed by Walter Carlton. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and a review wherever you hear it. And thanks so much for listening.